of all, I have a note here to myself that says this class will meet in 3 weeks, because 2 weeks from tonight is Thanksgiving. Okay. Last time we left off still in the ice, and we're still going to be in the ice at the end of this talk yet. We talked last time about the origin of the ice from the rivers of frozen light called the Iliver, and they came from the fountain of fire and light called Vergelmer. We discussed that in terms of quantum ideas and in terms of spectral ideas. And we talked about Ymir as sort of being like an Adam Primus or an Osiris or some archetypal human being in circular form. Whether it's fetal or anti-fetal, one knows not, but most likely fetal, turning inward on itself. And we discussed a little bit of the zodiacal human. We ended up talking about Ymir as he thawed out of the ice, alternately slept and waked, and while he was awake he didn't do much, but while he was asleep he was sweating. Hi, Eddie. And then we talked about the conception of being sweat-born. And we said that the sweat-born of Ymir appeared under his left armpit and between his thighs. And that out of the left armpit came a prototype man and woman, and between his thighs came a 6-headed giant who is unnamed, but that 6-headed giant was prolific. One doesn't know how, since no giantesses have been mentioned anywhere, but it was prolific and produced a whole race of giants. Then we spent a whole bunch of time saying that since the arms and armpit are ruled by Gemini and the thighs are ruled by Sagittarius, and that since Gemini and Sagittarius on the sidereal or in the sidereal sphere mark the signs of the zodiac or the constellations of the zodiac that have the Milky Way passing through, we talked about this then being an orientation, not only to the zodiac with the zodiacal human, but orienting the zodiac and the whole plane of the solar system to the Milky Way. Then we started, we talked a little bit about some of the science of this, and then we spoke about the northern and southern gates of Cancer and Capricorn, and we broke off there. And I want to continue there because there's one idea that wasn't covered very well at all. And it's a really important thing for us in our becoming and in our doing what we have to do to the world, or for the world, or with the world. I want to go back to the race of the original man and woman born from the armpit. And I want to talk, I'll put them in the sexual statements, because sexist statements, because they are more classical and people will remember them more easily. But there are 2 statements about humanity that define humanity from classical times, and have been repeated again. All men are second one is classical, is man is a rational animal. Well, I think they go more back to Aristotle, I think. I'm not certain about that. You can say it in a better way. You can say humans are mortal. Shorter sentence. Consider more chalk that way. And you can say humans are rational creatures. Which leads us directly into what we're trying to get at. By the way, this is going to be pretty short tonight, I hope. Less than 2 tapes, which is the first time in a long time, I think. These statements are very universal, and they are in some ways so profound that they seem trite. It often happens that way when you can't live the full truth or meaning of something. It becomes trite, and its meaning is easily overlooked. Everybody thinks they understand what it means. If we look at them together and take a little bit of a non-standard look at them, they become very important for our daily work. In one way, they are one and the same statement. The reason is that as far as concrete rationality separates us both from the animals and from the gods. The animals are creatures and are very finite, and the gods are immortal. So it is thought that separates us from immortality. One might say then that creatures, as opposed to creators, are all mortals. And the second statement is that, looking at it in another way, thinking is what humanifies us. And that seems very peculiar, but it actually is so that the more we think, the more human we become. It's really not a matter that we think too much. It's a matter that we think too little. A lot of what passes for thought is really not thought. It's not really putting our mind to understanding something. We take a lot of things for granted, and we mimic thought when we're really not thinking, and it becomes a sort of like a nervous activity. Real thought, as anybody who's ever studied Plato and Socrates, real thought is creative and it is spontaneous, because one never knows where thinking is going to take one. It takes one into all sorts of understandings that we never thought were there. So there are all kinds of varieties of thought. And the gist of what I'm trying to say is very simple, and that is thought is our human service to the cosmos. When something is in the mineral stage of evolution, its service, or what it gives to the cosmos, is some kind of stable, concrete form. A concrete form that has all kinds of different qualities to it. The mineral states have many different qualities. Plants, on the other hand, at least for the other creatures, their service is vitality. That in the higher stages of evolution, the animal and the human stages of evolution, we sacrifice the ability to take energy and life as it comes straight from the sun and to assimilate it and make it part of ourselves. In order to do higher things, we have to sacrifice some of the lower things. But that sacrifice gives the opportunity then to the plant kingdom to serve. And so no animal and no human can exist without the plant kingdom, without the vitality that comes from the plant kingdom, because that is the source and that is the service that the plants have to offer. In the animal stage of evolution, the service is motivation, or motive, or desire, or feeling. But for humans, our service to the cosmos is thought. Thought is what we give, and thought is what the universe needs from us. The gods, in their part in creation, do not objectively, externally see, at least, especially in the material world, they don't see their creations, and they can have no thoughts on them. They can have no judgments on them. And it depends on humans to do that. So because we have rebelled and because we have separated and we've each developed unique lines of thought, unique lines of character, we each have a very important kind of insight to offer. So I like people who write amateur poetry, because when people write amateur poetry, they're putting their own line of thought as to what they're seeing around them in the world. So it is an important principle of humanification that all of the signs that have to do with thinking in the zodiac have only human symbols. So this means that the way the whole zodiac has been laid down for humans is that the signs that are most associated with concrete reasoning always have pictures of humans in them. We have the Gemini, the two twins, and then we have the Virgin Maiden with the stalks of grain in Virgo. And then in the other Aries signs, we have Libra, the lady, blind lady with the scales, Venus, the goddess of justice, or the titan of justice, and finally in Aquarius, we have the water bearer. So that it is constantly brought to our attention throughout astrology that humanity and thinking are one and the same, or they are very, very close to each other. We've often looked at, in this course, or in precursors to this course, we've looked at the whole idea of how thoughts precipitate out of ideas. That when we have an idea, we can create an invention or a concrete manifestation of that idea. And there is a densification or condensation or precipitation that comes about in thought. We did last year note a little bit about what goes the other direction. We've talked a little bit about memory in concrete thinking running the other way. We talked about a word that the source of it isn't too much looked at, and that is the word assimilation. That is, the process of assimilation is memory in the realm of the concrete thought. That is, memory is not just a recalling of what happened, but assimilative memory is seeing how similar various components are. And by the process of assimilative memory, we note the idea out of which many thoughts have developed, or many perceptions have developed. When we assimilate experience, we know that there's a thought behind every desire, and a thought behind every desire that becomes an action, and a thought behind every action that becomes a form or an impact or something like that. We know all about that. We can follow that idea all the way down from the conception of the idea all the way through the thought until the object. But the perception, where we take the object or the experience in the external world and carry it back through the ethers, where we get the energy and the motive and finally the thought, and then we assimilate it to the universal idea and then discover how things that we see in the world, be they trees or be they books or be they colors, are all tied together in one universal idea. That is a process of thinking, an assimilative type of thought. Now, last time we talked about top-down versus bottom-up perspectives, and we spoke about the absurdity of trying to take something lesser and have it create something greater than itself. We just thought that was utterly absurd, but there is something. It's not that we can actually create something greater than ourselves. That is not untrue as far as awakening. That is to say, something lesser can awaken something greater that is already there. For the best example is teaching. If there is some simple process that we think we know, and we go to teach it, especially if we go to teach it for the first time, in that very simple, known, very well-known thing, in the process of teaching that, we discover that we don't know it so well, because another person looks at things altogether differently than we look at them, and we have to get a higher grasp of what we know, and we have to have a more universal understanding of the thing that we know that includes the perspective of another person. So even though we may be teaching something that is very simple and very well understood by ourselves, the very act of doing that sometimes wakes up something higher in ourselves. So in a peculiar way, mortality doesn't create something greater than itself, but it does give birth to immortality. That is to say that in the process of thinking, whether it be creative thinking, the condensing kind of thinking, which is like asking questions or making forms for meaning to enter into, or whether it is assimilative thinking where there is a breakdown of forms to find the similar idea that is behind them, all of that activity requires the assertion of spiritual will. I don't mean necessarily only from the divine spirit, but from the whole capability of the threefold spirit altogether. When it asserts itself, it awakens. And so in the process of thinking, we become aware of the thinker, and the thinker is empowered in spiritual energy. And in the case of assimilative thinking, it's actually nourished in that its own things have come back to it, or the divine creation and the experience in divine creation come back to it in ways that gives it greater strength. So there is an awakening in that. In the same way, the position of the armpit and the thighs orient the solar cosmic creation to the Milky Way and to all of the universe in heavens. The Gemini and Sagittarius then also orient us to our place in the cosmos, meaning to say that the concrete thinking awakens the divine thinking, and that the divine, in asserting itself in the idea or in the selfhood of it, its godly qualities, does the thinking. But that process of concrete thinking wakes up divinity in us. So that's what I wanted to cover last time, but I really didn't have time to cover that correctly. Now, there are a couple other little things that I didn't do last time that I wanted to do, and that is, I wanted to talk a little bit on the whole idea of the polar coordinate, that it represented a two-focus system. Because as long as you have only a one-focus system, you can't really come to know something. If you are at one with something, your experience is ineffable. There is no separation. There is no boundary. A great deal of knowledge and a great deal of awareness comes from being able to step outside of yourself, to gain some kind of objectivity or to know things outside of yourself, and you normally need 2 points of view to be able to do that. The beginning of knowledge always begins with Gemini, and the beginning of knowledge begins with comparison. The first time you taste a mango, it tastes like a peach. But after a while, a mango tastes like a mango, but the differentiation between mangoes and peaches, at first you try to make it be like something else, and in the second case you have a finer gradation of differentiation, and there's more knowledge or more appreciation of reality, and boy, mangoes are really an appreciation of reality, comes from that having 2 points. And when we talked about a polar coordinate where we have one radius and either theta or phi for 2 angular directions, or I should say in this direction, that you have a two-focus system automatically in the Northern European mythology, because here you have the fire Virgulmer, the fountain of fire and light, and it's flowing out until it freezes, and then out here you have ice, and here you have fire in this kind of outlook, and then gradually you have a second point. And that second reference, even though it turns out to be a circle in 2 dimensions, or it turns out to be a sphere in 3 dimensions, that second point is what gives an objectivity. Because if you were to stay in one point, you would only have 1 point. The second point that I wanted to bring out last time that I never had the time to bring out because I was got so excited and I got carried away with what I was saying that I never got it said, is that clearly when the fire is melting the ice and the ice is dripping and the cosmic man is being disclosed in the ice with the head here going around and has his kidneys over here and his feet at his head, that as he's being exposed, the realm of fire is proceeding further and further out. The second point gets further and further and further, and there is a constant encroachment of Muspelheim on Niflheim, and so we have an expanding universe, which goes right along with the whole idea of modern cosmology, that the universe is in a perpetual state of expansion, that from the original Big Bang or from the original cosmic word, that there's been a constant assertion of spiritual creativity to go further and further and further out to the extent of the will of the Supreme Being and no further. Then eventually there is a collapsing again, which is associated with a greater and greater condensation, and things freeze over again. So it's an expanding universe. Now, the expansion of the fire did not, the fire itself usually represents some kind of sacrificial love, because it would seem more easy and it would seem almost like superconductivity, where there would be no resistance if the Supreme Being were to stay sleeping in the Absolute. Or on another level, if Ymir were to stay sleeping and not be sacrificed in that fire and light that comes out from a common center. It means indeed, almost in all cases, and mystics are universally agreed about this, that fire, and especially heat, is a representation of love. That to take on the sacrifice and to strike out against the ignorance that is in the unknown, and to assert oneself against the friction of that which would just as soon stay in frozen ignorance, requires a giving of oneself, and of giving of oneself in a way that is probably going to be something like pain. So drip by drip, as we saw last time, Ymir came out of the ice. But Ymir was not alone in the ice. By the way, some people think Ymir is the same as Yama, the god of death in Hindu astrology. Ymir and Yama both being the source of life and death, and that whole, the Father, the invisible center, black holes, and all of those things are scorpionic ideas. And Ymir and Yama, it's believable to me. I can't say that I know that for authority. Of course, having the sun in Scorpio, I'm very inclined to think that it's true that I'm associated with the highest of all beings. But as the ice continued to drip, and Ymir continued to alternate between sleeping and waking, something else appeared in the ice. And that was Adumbla. And Adumbla is a cow. This is almost all the story we're having tonight. That's it. Yeah, that's it. Right. She is the heavenly cow. But she licks the ice, and she licks the ice for the salt that's in the ice. And as she licks the salt out of the ice, milk flows from her tits, and she feeds Ymir as he's spontaneously sweating out races of humans and gods. Now, this sounds like a pretty far-fetched and fantastical story at this point, but it's not any more so than any of the other myths that we've looked at. In fact, most of the symbols are pretty identical. The cow is very common. We didn't go into them, but there is a cow at the beginning in Hindu mythology, and especially in Egyptian mythology, there is the cow that has the paps that feed all of the gods, and they all derive their immortality from this cow. So we're going to talk a little bit about cow mythology without talking about Brahm. It's just about cows, because Brahm is actually a male cow, a bull. Now, though it seems like a very materialistic symbol, and it seems simplistic and awkward, Audumbla represents the spiritual feminine. Not the feminine of space matter, but the spiritual feminine that is in the spirit. Something like as in the threefold spirit of the Godhead, as taught in Rosicrucian teaching, it would be something like the feminine life spirit. It would be almost impossible if we were talking to very simple people who are just beginning to have waking consciousness and are just beginning to have rational consciousness. It would be very difficult to transfer to the attention of such people the rare ideas of, like, for example, the divine light of the cosmic feminine, as we talked about it last year in Neoplatonism. So something very simple is taken to appeal to the very early developing consciousness of humans, and if there is something that provides spiritual life and something that provides, in effect, spiritual nutrition, that is available and easily understood to simple folk. It's not unusual to use something like a cow. And that's what we're trying to get at. Element, substance, nutrition has always been associated with the nurturative spiritual feminine. We've talked about it before in other ways, saying that the masculine is associated with stark, straight line, rectilinear assertions of will, where the vibration is so rapid that it seems to be dense and static and constant. The unmoved mover. Perhaps there's even greater motion there, but the motion is so fast and it's so steady that it seems as if it's solid, or that it is unmoving. It's because we're at that edge between the absolute and the complete manifestation. We've talked about it before. We've talked about absolutely fast motion and absolutely slow motion. Ironically produce the same end, because absolutely slow motion is completely frozen like ice, whereas absolutely fast motion is like light that's so subtle that it's dark, and projections of that being that are so fast in their vibration that they seem like straight line consciousness. Now, we've talked about these things before. We'll go back to some of our original pictures. Anytime that there is a projection of energy, that's considered masculine. Around it, there forms a field. Whether it is an electromagnetic field going along in the direction of a particle, forming around a particle, or whether it is a torque field that has to do with twisting something or just ramming through something. Something forms around it. Comparatively speaking, the light that is the life spirit compared to the divine spirit, or the cosmic feminine compared to the cosmic masculine, seems light relative to dark. And it seems variant as opposed to rectilinear and straight line. So we looked at all of this last year when we looked in Neoplatonism at the noetic noeric, that we saw that it went from a dark light to a bright light, or it went from the invisibility of the Father to the light of lucidity of the Son. Okay, the same principle of appearing to be more fluctuant, even though it's going at a slower rate of time. We're looking from the bottom up now. I should say that we're looking from the bottom up perspective, that the divine masculine is so far beyond us and is so rapid and so directed that it appears as a stationary straight line. The life spirit, which is not as vibrant as the divine spirit, appears to us to be moving faster because it's what we can see. It's sort of like a spiritual optical illusion. In fact, if you go one level less lower, if you go to the human spirit, or you go to the realm of Shiv, Shiv seems to be moving all the more faster even than the life spirit or the human spirit. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. One is that there is that same kind of comparative quality. Because something is nearer to you in consciousness, or because something is nearer to you in time or in space, it always seems like it's moving much, much faster. If you took something like a jet plane and it went through this room, it would be seeming to be going extremely fast because it was so near to us. But if you took that same jet plane and you put it maybe 4,000 feet up in space, it seems like it's going much slower. And so things that are closer, both in consciousness and in space, extensive and intensive, seem to be going much faster. And the scope of things is smaller. I don't know how to say it. The life spirit, or the divine feminine, has a much greater scope of spirit. And it isn't going through all of the greater ideational definition. And therefore, as the scope of something is small, it seems to go faster, or the motion seems to go faster, even though it's really going slower. You get what I'm trying to talk about optical illusions of consciousness. Illusions of consciousness, because they're all coming onto us at some time or another. I once talked to a man who, you know how they do it? They try to do it in movies where they have things, there's a critical moment and time seems to slow down to where it almost stops, Or if you're in an automobile accident or something like that, you can see another car coming at you and it seems to be going slow. That's not because time has slowed down. That's because you have sped up your consciousness so much that you're going at such a fast level that you have enough time to see all the things that take place. I spoke to a man once that was a police officer that was attacked or came upon 3 or 4 people, all of whom were armed. And he had to defend himself. And he had to take out all 3 of them. And he told me, he said, it's amazing what happens inside of yourself when you're trained or when you put yourself in that state of consciousness. He says you're so fast that everything happens really slowly and you can see which person you have to go for first and how you have to address each person. And he said he was just utterly amazed when he told me the story. He was aghast at what he had to do, but that's a thing where you are moving ever so much faster, and it seems like things are going slower. I think with each succeeding rise in consciousness, we'll have to face that same thing. The type of motion is also much different in the world of human spirit as opposed to life spirit. It's a more rotary type of motion, and everything seems to be spinning. It's not like the larger revolutions of life spirit where everything seems to be like waves, or like in the divine spirit where the waves are so strung out they seem to be straight lines. Plus, in the human spirit, there's a subjectivity that comes with selfhood, and that seems to make things seem going around you at dizzying speeds. And the whole consciousness of the human spirit is meant to be a consciousness of frequency. All right. In the same way, this is a tough statement to make. I'm going to have to stop and think a little bit. In the same way that in the hourglass of manifestation, where this is the phenomenal, this is the transcendental. In the phenomenal, this is the realm of forms. It's the realm of experience. Whereas the transcendental is the realm of meanings, or what is within or behind the phenomena or the formal experiences. This same principle of meaning relative to form can be applied to any 2 succeedent planes of consciousness. That is to say that to get to where we're trying to get to in the life spirit, the life spirit is the form whose meaning is the divine spirit. And therefore, light is the expression of the truth and goodness of the divine spirit that is seemingly permanent. So that, you can take that in anything. You might say that life or even desire is the meaning to vitality. What's the use of moving if you don't have a desire to move anywhere, if you don't have a motive? And what's the use of having a motive if there isn't a thought, if there isn't a reason for it? What's the use of having a reason if there isn't a higher purpose? And so it goes in that same way. Now, if we take this to the ultimate level of the cosmic masculine, wrapped around by the cosmic feminine, this is the ultimate case. And it is not just a mathematical analog, it is the fundamental relationship of the spiritual feminine to the spiritual masculine. Therefore, it is not surprising then to see a flow of milk representing the consciousness that proceeds out from the divine spirit and comes in waves back to it, the life that goes out from the divine spirit, as seeing that as a milk process, a licking experience and then coming back as milk. All right. I'm not hitting this exactly as I want to. I'm not in a perfect concentration for where I want to be, so I'm just going to keep moving on. We may be very short. This relationship, then, of the feminine surrounding and nourishing and bringing in a spirit soul to the first cause or to the first state of being is a fundamental relationship of all states of being. And going back to our mythical story, it brings us back to the Milky Way. This fundamental principle, then, of the divine feminine to the divine masculine, both of which absolutely necessary to each other, relates us right back to the Milky Way. It's sort of like saying again that the source or the meaning for the creator or the divine center of our whole solar cosmos is the Milky Way. That orientation is not in vain. It's not just say, oh, isn't it nice that this is associated with the Milky Way. That's where our purpose comes from. It's to say that the galactic center is the ultimate source for the being that we call God in our solar system. In fact, it is much more literal than one might think. The Milky Way looks milky because of the abundance of stars relatively close as part of our own galaxy. But there is another quality that is described by physicists and is also described by mystics, that there are gigantic rushes and fluxes of higher energy. The ancient mystics described them as milk or as curds flowing through space, and that there is indeed a cosmic feminine that relates to a cosmic masculine that allows the whole creativity itself to take place with something that is represented in the physical etheric plane as like a flowing plasma energy. And so, like when we're talking about Adumbla and the milk, we're going right back to that kind of thing. Even in a more earthly way, this is relevant, because the four paths on Adumbla relate, as they relate to our being in the solar system. This is something that scientists discovered back in the I think it was the late 50s or early 60s. There was a discovery that at the turning points, at the solstices and equinoxes, which describe both the heaven and the earth from the earthly point of view, that at those times there are large influxes of energy, not solar winds, but not dissimilar from solar winds, that whenever we get exactly in the plane of the ecliptic, or whenever we are at the near point and the far point in the solar, in the revolution around the sun, at those points when we hit the exact point is like it's sort of like a lightning or gapping at a spark plug. There are huge bursts of energy that come to the Earth and strike at poles. So something like that is like the vortex of Adumbla. Okay, this in effect, in terms of liveliness and vitality, represents again a kind of nourishment. Now, this polarized flux of energy brings us to the main topic of the night, which I'm going to go through very fast because it's something that I wanted to spend a whole bunch of weeks on, and I may very well, at some time in the future, where mythology meets modern mythology in terms of science. And just consider this an introduction to a modern mythology. And so we need to talk about salt. Salt that is in the ice. Now we've already seen all these. We've seen spectroscopy. We've seen nebular theory. We've seen all kinds. Now looked at plasma, and all of these ideas. We've seen again and again in Northern European mythology, and now we come to another science that is inherently in the creation story, and that is chemistry. If the milk that Adumbla represents a kind of spiritual living light, then what does the salt represent? That's the question we're asking ourselves. And we have to go back to what we looked at last week. We looked last week at the Olivigar, the rivers of light and fire that they flowed out from Virgelmer, that fountain. And this light flowed out, each probably had, each stream of the Olivigar probably having a little bit different tint or color to it so that they produced an entire spectrum. They all flowed out until they froze. And they froze in the ice in the region of cold of Niflheim. And the description that is given by the ancient poets that wrote the myth down, they said that this happens the same way that a spark condenses out of a flame or is found within a flame. Now, we've talked about fire and ice in terms of being hot and cold. And how they sustain a constant battle between them, or they represent two poles in the direction of time and space. Now, when we bring in the ice, we're going to bring in something much more qualitative. Just a few minutes ago, we looked at a picture of the masculine and feminine using a projective line for the masculine and a surrounding field for the feminine. The elements of this image are twofold. There is the line and there is the circle. And they represent the extremes of consciousness of the ideas embodied in masculinity and in femininity. These are symbols, and as symbols they are abstract, but in creation they become reality. The line is something that projects itself. And it is a projection of consciousness or an extension of logic. This follows this, follows this, follows this. That's what happens with thinking. You can get so carried away that you can follow a line of thought so far out that it becomes tangential. It would go on ad infinitum. But eventually, if the line were all by itself alone, it loses touch with its origin. It loses touch with its center, and it is indeed tangential. It's just gone off. The circle, on the other hand, is something that contains and it defines, it protects, it reflects, and it circulates. It's like containing a region of space. And even if there is a rotation in that, it rotates or it cycles, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's very repetitive, and that repetition just sort of, as we say, spins its wheels. There's no traction that would move it in a straight line. If you take, and I'm going to say things that I don't mean to be taken in a sexist way, but if you take archetypal pictures from experience of the masculine life versus the feminine life, and I've had a taste of living the feminine life for one whole winter, and it was really strange for me. In the masculine life, the next point down is an objective. You go out and you try to attain that objective. You know, put a man in a car and he tries to see whether he can drive 1,500 miles in a day. That's his objective. How far can we get? You know, don't stop here and mosey around and circle around and see some things. How far can we get? It's one objective after another objective after another objective. We accomplish things. However, in the feminine life, children have to be fed. Things have to be cleaned up. There are these cycles that go around again and again, and it seems like nothing is accomplished. That the cycle goes on again and again and again, and you're never getting out to any objective. What happens is in the cycle, or within this spinning, the children eventually grow up, and it seems when they step outside of the circle, it seems almost miraculous because they have become, without there being any linear idea. So you can see that there are drawbacks to both kinds of consciousness. One just stays in place and spins, and it's always relative to that center, whether that center is the home or whether it's the earth itself. It stays in one place and nothing is done. On the other hand, with the other, you get somewhere, but when you get somewhere, that place isn't defined as being anywhere. If you take them to their complete. Now, there are figures that include both of these elements, and this is one of those figures, the spiral. The spiral has all the cyclicity of a circle, where you go through all of the spectral qualities again and again, but as you do so, there is progress. Things go forward. There are various different kinds of spirals. There are spirals that are more masculine, and there's spirals that are more feminine. This is sort of an elongated heliochord. And you find those spirals, for example, in the branching of a pine tree. If you climb up in a pine tree and look down, you see the spiral that is a heliochord, and there is that projection. It's trying to get somewhere, to the sun. Or, if you look in the horns of a gazelle, There's that same kind of, they're more linear than they are circular. There are also circular or more feminine spirals, like Archimedean spirals. One Archimedean spiral represents the growth rate, which fits right into what we've been talking about. Another represents the womb in which our solar system is growing. The spiral galaxy is a spiral that is much more circular than it is linear. So this is like a feminine kind of womb where there is a progress, but the progress is from within out rather than linear in some direction. There is yet another kind of spiral. Oh, I forgot all my demonstrations. I was going to have all kinds of demonstrations tonight. There is another kind of spiral that represents the whole creation itself. And that is the lemniscat spiral. But the lemniscat spiral that we draw on the board can't be anything like the real lemniscat spiral, because the real lemniscat spiral is like amoeba strip. Do you know what amoeba strip is? Oh boy, you want to take a break and have me make amoeba strip? Good, we'll do that. Amoeba strip is taken by, now this would be just a cylinder. There would be an inside and there will be an outside. But instead of connecting them that way, if you put one twist in, like a lemniscat, and then connect it together, you have amoeba strip. And the quality of the amoeba strip is that it is like one-dimensional and two-dimensional at the same time. That if you follow it around so that you're going around on the outside and continue to follow, the outside eventually becomes the inside and you come right back where you started. So both sides or both surfaces are experienced as one surface, so it is one-dimensional and two-dimensional at the same time. You can do the same thing. You can produce three-dimensional objects. They're called Klein bottles, where they are three-dimensional and two-dimensional at the same time. And using the lemniscat principle like that, they can go all the way up to n dimensions. And what it is a representation of something that is linear and circular and spiral, where the inside and the outside are one and the same thing, that it all depends on where you are in the figure, whether you are outside or whether you are inside. And you can see that this is a divine, some people claim, direct representation of the formation of the cosmos, which works from within out and then turns on itself and then turns back in, so that the outside becomes the inside, and that the line of consciousness that carries one out also carries one back in and is transformed in its by the same activity, so that it has that spiral quality. If you want to look at it and play around with it, I'll pass it around. It goes so far. This is a very poor edition of this book, Principles of Light and Color. It was edited by a modern colorist who didn't know anything at all about clairvoyance. The original version of the book you can still buy for about $300 or $400 if you want to buy it. It was written by a clairvoyant. In fact, the clairvoyant became friends with Max Heindel, and the first edition was in fact, edited by Max Heindel. It's done in lemniscat, it's done in heliochord fashion, but this is a picture of the primordial atom, that is the caduceus of Mercury, with the initiate line going up the center and all of the external rounds and revolutions of consciousness, as we go through the different periods in the outer wrappings of the spiral. This is supposed to represent indeed the basic atom, but that is the primordial atom that is the whole solar system. What I intended to do, but I didn't, there is a book on occult chemistry where several clairvoyants got together and looked at the spiral curves of different atoms, the paths that the so-called electrons take through various different atoms, and they drew the pictures of the atoms of all of the different elements, which brings us a little closer to where we're trying to get. The masculine and feminine spirals, like the heliochords and the Archimedean spirals as extremes, are spirals that are best drawn or simplest drawn or mathematically understood by Cartesian coordinates. However, the lemniscat spiral is more easily understood by polar coordinates. So we're right back again that the spiritual, more internal outlook is again associated with the top-down polar coordinate rather than from the outside in with the rectilinear coordinates. Ah, boy. So, let's do a little bit, let's just say then that various spirals represent various states of consciousness. I don't want to get too tedious here. I've got an enormous amount of information that we're going through really quickly. These lines of consciousness that are represented actually as we see them in space, like with the gazelle's horns, or that in abstract represent something like the growth ratio for the Archimedean spiral, they represent lines of consciousness or grades of consciousness. Now, the double helix, DNA, RNA, seems to be the line of consciousness that represents the relationship of the etheric body, the vital body, to the etheric world to the physical world in anything that has a living body. Like DNA, RNA is identical whether it is in a moss or whether it is in a pig or whether it is in a human. But all living, growing forms have this same spiral. It also appears to be, in some way, a miniature of the primordial spiral. And according to the evolutionary history, that is what the being has experienced, is where it produces the genetic differences that produce whether it's going to be that indicate whether it's going to produce a plant form, an animal form, or a human form. It's like saying that the relationship of the consciousness of the evolving being to the archetypal idea that is represented in the double lemniscat spiral is what allows the being to manifest its form. All right. I'm getting into things that I'm trying to say a lot of things really, really fast. There is another relationship of spirals that relates the etheric realm to the material realm, and that is the family of spirals that talks about the basic matter-energy relationship. It is like saying that the more energetic parts of the atom that relate to the more static parts of the atom, that there is a spiral relationship between the consciousness of the energetic to the static. And so, you know what I'm trying to talk about? I'm trying to talk about an atom very much like it is portrayed in that book, and I'm trying to say that every atom has like a static nucleus, and then it has a very complex spiral around it of the active part, which is very much like the relationship, again, of Adumbla to the sleeping Ymir. And this line of consciousness, this energy, this line of consciousness that is in the spiral of the field of an atom is, oh boy, it relates to how the consciousness that is streaming into matter from the deepest spiritual realms, as it works from the etheric into the material, it goes through this dance. It's like dancing around an area of frozen space, and that sometimes it materializes in there, and it's like it's trying to, it's like an educational process. Sometimes we learning to play a song. You have to play it over many, many, many times, and then finally you get it. And then finally you get it in such a way that you can interpret that song and that you can put yourself into it. The same way, if the divine is trying to understand the unknown as it manifests in matter in space, in particles in space, the way it wraps itself around in active spiral paths, that kind of dance describes both the nature of the material that it is trying to understand and its relationship to that nature, or its character relative to that nature, so that each atom has a character that is all its own, or each element has a character that is all of its own. We've gotten into something very, very big, much larger than I wanted to get into, the mythology of chemistry in one talk. There are many, many, many different kinds of atoms. There are an increasing number of material states. And there are an increasing number of levels of spirals. And there is a whole family of shapes of spirals. Because what I'm putting down here are just very simple circular sort of things. And there is, so what I'm trying, how many of you are familiar with chemistry? Nobody. No. What? Do you remember the periodical table? In the periodical table, there are 6 columns, and the 7th being the adepts. And that as you go down in the chart, there is an increasing number of layers of electron spirals. Like there's an inner spiral and then one more outward. As you go this way or this way, the more you go to this end, the more particulate states or the more electrons there are within the spiral, And the more you go this way, the less particulate states that there are. As you go down layer by layer, not only are there more layers in each layers of spirals, but there are more varieties of the shapes of the spirals. So that in the first you have just hydrogen and helium as the inert. Then you have lithium, and you have chlorine. And what is the, I forget what it is. But then you have 4 members, until you get a very large number, so that there are all kinds of varieties. There's an increase in layers, there's an increase or decrease in number of particulate states within the layers, and such like that. All of these represent like states in a cosmic dance, places where you take a perspective or where you condense your consciousness. The more something is in this direction, no matter how many layers it has, the fewer electrons it has in its outer shell, and it is more flexible and willing to give them up. The more you go in the other direction, the more electron states there are, and the more they take on, so that these can combine. And the more you are in one direction or the other, the more reactive they are. At this end of the chart, you have the metals. At this end, you have the non-metals. And the metals have a very material quality about them. That is, they're dull, they're flat, they're opaque, they're colorless, roughly colorless, they're crystalline. The other end, they're more amorphous or gaseous, and they're more colorful, and so like there are 2 poles of elements. I'm going through this way too fast, but I just want to get the whole idea. And these elements, the metals, interact and combine with the non-metals, and they produce compounds. And those compounds are like the weddings or like the wars of different kinds of opposites. There is a whole spectral flavor in this that is very much like the spectral flavor of astrology. In fact, if we get to do this right maybe next year, I don't know if I want to do this or not because it's a huge thing, you can see that there are astrological connections. Not only that, they are all called states of hydrogen, because everything in the cosmos in the material sense is compounded out of hydrogen. 2 hydrogens rammed together become helium. And then hydrogen is associated with the metals, and it goes together, hydrogen, oxygen, and whatever metal, whether it's, let's say, sodium, would produce a compound that is called a hydroxide. It's like a lye. It's sort of the ultimate of the metallic state. It's so metallic that it's reactively interactive with anything else. However, you put hydrogen and or oxygen with any of the nonmetals, like, say, chlorine, and you have an acid. And so the ultimate of combined energies of the 2 states of fire and air, which represent hydrogen and oxygen, together with all of these metals and nonmetals, produce the 2 most reactive conditions of the experience, because we live here to gain experience. And the more resonant or the more strong or the more intense that experience, the more we get out of it. And so in the interactions of hydroxides or lyes together with acids, what are produced are two things: water and salts. So what we're trying to get at then is, let's go back and try to review the whole thing. In a spiral way, Spirit is working itself through different spirals representing the relationships between different planes, deeper and deeper into the unknown, and bringing out different attributes of it in thought, in desire, in action, until it comes all the way down to frozen ignorance in matter, and that there are these spirals that are extremes, that represent extremes of the relationship of matter, which themselves, when brought together, each has a quality. There's like a war of atoms that when they are brought together, their struggle produces a compound, which is a wedding of extreme opposites, such that if you take the third member in the hydrogen is always the first member, second member is lithium, and the third is sodium. If you take the third member on the other side, you have hydrogen, you have fluorine, and then you have chlorine. So the epitome of the third in each category represents the salt of salts, sodium chloride. The epitomizing third is there. So a salt then represents the extremes of spirit as polarized in matter, in metals and nonmetals, and alkalis and acids, in their interaction with each other. So the cosmic masculine and the cosmic feminine become two different kinds of spiral dances in a metal and a non-metal, and as they interact with each other, they are, each of these spirals is relating to that unknown in matter in a different way, so that it has a different flavor. And when they interact with each other, it is sort of like a union of the two viewpoints qualitatively of the masculine and feminine bound up in an experience. That in a chemical interaction that results in a compound, and that compound that is a salt, that represents the experience of the divine in matter. This is what it means when it says, like in the Bible, and what shall happen if the salt loses its savor? It's meaning to say that that is a crystallized experience, an experience of the unknown that is reflected from the known in the dance, but the unknown wasn't there. It's in the dark. You don't even know where the particular states are going to be with certainty. And so that kind of experience then, the salt that is in the ice that Audumbla licks, represents the most fundamental or most basic kind of experience, or the most static kind of relationship that we have with, as far as we can go out into the unknown in our creative projection in the material cosmos. So the salt, even though salt itself isn't a food to us, it's almost a poison. In fact, all foods are poison to us. But the salt represents form. You know, like in the womb, the whole chemistry is saline. Without the salinity, there would be no forming in the womb. So what Audumbla is licking the salt This is a representation. We said that the cow represents the feminine that is cycling and flowing, and in this case it's flowing all the way as deep into material experience as we can go, and it is drawing that back as a food that is a nourishment to Ymir, who represents the statement of will that does things in an apparently passive way. By doing nothing, it is accomplishing all of these kinds of things. All right. I wanted to say much more than that, but I could see that it would get very, very tedious very quickly. Wanted to see an interesting little sideline. If you take the fourth, which is potassium, and the fourth on the other side is bromine, and you put them together in the same way that the third and the third represent the epitome of the piquancy of spirit, the four, which is a material number, when you put the fourth together with the fourth, you have potassium bromide, which is a sedative. It's what people use to go to sleep or to lose their memory and such like that. It's phenomenal what you can get out of the atomic chart. And I just sat down for a few minutes and started playing around. It must be really great for the people who have the kind of clairvoyance that can look into that. All right. So that's as far as we got. The cow is now thawed out of the ice, and she's hastening the process of the thawing of ice by licking, and by that licking has started the whole rotational or revolutionary experience of the evolution by taking in salt, which represents crystallized experience, and giving out milk, which represents a spiritual soul substance, which feeds the divine spirit, and the whole process begins, and the thawing goes further and further. Next time we have a little bit more to do in the ice, because we have a whole bunch of beings that we have to talk about. And if you think the castration of Uranus was bad, when we come, this becomes destruction at its very worst. I'll try not to get into a whole bunch of tedious things, because this is going way too slow. I want to get more into the stories, but I've just been utterly fascinated by all of this. Are there any questions or objections, or it's foreign to us, and the only way we can make it part of us. In fact, this was recently announced. Within the last 18 months, it was announced by scientists that they think that all foods are allergenic, in that they disrupt the body, and it's just that some things we have the ability to overpower, and when we overpower them, they are no longer allergens or poisons to us. And anytime we take something in foreign, we're giving up part of our life to make it part of us. And when you're giving... Yes. Well, I didn't mean to say that I didn't mean poison in saying that eating was bad, because it's oh, come on. Come on. I object. I enjoy eating food, and in fact, it is a duty to eat food. Because if we don't, it may be one of the few services that I really do in life is metabolizing food. It's one of my cosmic experiences, or at least I assert the will in the digestion of it. All right. So we'll meet in 3 weeks, and we'll start talking about Bergelmer and a whole bunch of other frost giants and things like that.